Hello there, my friends. Welcome to another installment of the Batman GM's revisitation of Iron Crown Enterprises Middle-earth role-playing game system, otherwise known as MERP. This particular one is Lorien and the Halls of the Elven Smiths. This is probably one of the top 5 source books to have if you're going to do Lord of the Rings of any sort, because in part it focuses on the elves and elves as we know it in Western Endor. And sections of it in here are very useful in that aspect. They literally give you a good bio and history of the Elvish peoples and their divisions and their lifestyles and so on and so forth. As a game, this is a source book. Come with a nice big map. I think it actually came with 2 maps. It's broken down into 2 sections. It focuses on Lorien and it focuses on Ost and Adel, which is the Elvish city that precedes Lorien and is known as located in Holland. And we only get a brief touch in the novels where the 9 walkers are on their way south, and it's before they hit Moria, and they're passing through the hills of Holland, and the carabine or the crows swoop out of the sky, and they take cover. And what we don't know is that the Elvish community that was there was a vast city. It was very big, one of the largest civilizations, Elvish kingdoms of its time, perhaps the last of the true Elvish kingdoms in Middle Earth, at least in Western Middle Earth. It is another note is it was the peak of Elvish culture and technology in Middle Earth at the time, and we see nothing like it afterwards because the elves are in decline. If anything, this is the beginning of the end for the elves. This is once this city falls, the decline is on, and it just snowballs from there and gradually builds up and continues to grow. And it's in this location that Sauron, under the guise of the giver of gifts, before he was, he could still take on a pleasing form, disguise himself as an extremely beautiful elf, which makes him stand out a little more. Came here and seduced Celebrimbor, who was the best of his craft, the best forger of his time. He is the descending stock of Fëanor and then their type, so he's able to create some very fantastic magical items, if you will, and magic stones and so on and so forth. And the 2 of them together, although Celebrimbor didn't quite understand that he was being duped, set out on the journey to create the 20 rings as we know it. And that's the 9, the 7, the 3, and the 1. And of course, Celebrimbor actually creates all but the 1 ring. The only ring that Sauron created himself is the 1 ring. And he had his hand in the creation of all the others. This is what allows him to tap into them using the 1 ring, but he himself did not create them. He had Celebrimbor do it for him. And through Celebrimbor, he learned some very important craft skills to complete the 1 ring when the time comes. But he also imparted a lot of knowledge to Celebrimbor, which is why Celebrimbor fell within his influence in the way that he did. At some point, Celebrimbor finally discovers he's been duped, and at the end of the day, gives up the 9 rings. He gives up the location of the 7, but he goes to his death with the secret of the 3 Elvish rings. And much to Sauron's total, hatred, I guess is a good word for it. Okay, so we got the history of the creation of Osten El Endel, and Lothlorien. We know that Galadriel and her husband originally was the rulers of Ostenal until Celebrimbor more or less controlled everything at some point. Him and his guild of jewelsmiths. Some of the most fantastic magical items of Middle Earth from the late Second Age was created in this particular city. They had glass elevators. They had magic lighting. They had fresh water with plumbing. This is literally the most advanced city ever in Middle Earth at this point, ever, before, after, as best I can tell. And the layout and material for it in here is pretty deep, and it's very interesting. We take for granted a lot of stuff that we get, and we don't always understand the concept, the nuances behind it. But when I look at some of the stuff in here, the estates and the artwork and things like that, they've made a lot of effort to really ratchet this particular place up, and we go into some great detail. The sad part is you can't really use this if you're playing in this traditional Middle Earth or Iron Crown Enterprises chosen timeline, which is 1640. This place has been a ruin for thousands of years at this point. You can go as an adventurer and dig around in the ruins of the foundations of these buildings and the underground, what's left of the underground portions of them, and maybe find the occasional rare treasure. But for the most part, if you want to actually play in it, adventure in it, you have to set your timeline in the Second Age at a much earlier point. It's interesting to note that this city was settled about 300 years before Tharbad. The city of Tharbad was initially established by the Numerians, the Westernese, the Dunedain, and later it became a critical seaport for Arnor for many years. So the city of Tharbad existed for almost 3,000 years in one form or another, and it only, this Osla Endel, or whatever, however it's pronounced, was only 300 years older, and about 25 miles upriver from it. So there was a lot of connection there. The fact that this also plays a critical location of Sauron's downfall. Sauron overextends himself. He comes down, invades this place, sacks it, then becomes in a rage because he can't get the other three rings from the Eldar. So he goes on a rampage and almost conquers all of Western Endor. The elves of Lindon under Gilligad and Elrod march to meet him and are almost wiped out. But the arrival of the great Numerian army lands, and the very fact that the Westernese, the ancestors of the Dunedain land in such force, forces Sauron to capitulate, because he is totally overwhelmed by the sheer firepower and martial might of Nuremberg. It's just that powerful at that point. But also, ironically, it's the beginning of the downfall for the men of the Westernese of Nuremberg, because the leadership arrogantly captures Sauron, puts him in chains, and marches him back to their island, and where he eventually uses his silver tongue to corrupt them and convince their ruler to lead an invasion of the Undying Lands, which leads to the downfall of Nuremberg. It's a very complicated set of scenarios that is there. So, at the time of Iron Crown's creation, this was the most elaborate source book dealing with elves. There should have been several more, but they never had a chance to get there. We should have seen one of Lindon, and we have Rivendell, and I grant you that. But Rivendell is more of a town or a village or an enclave, not an actual city or country of elves. And the only other, we have Lothlorien, so I guess all right. So there were several, but this one here trumps them all as far as I'm concerned. But there were several others that could have been created that they hadn't got around to doing. But if you want to look at the high elf culture, the Noldor culture as it was before, this is Lorien, so it is part of it. You can also look at the comparison between it and Lorien, because Lorien is a much more magical realm, if you will, where they live in the trees and they don't build a lot of structures. They don't have big fortifications, and their crafting capabilities and stuff are much more diminished. I mean, all you got to do is look at things like look at this little manor up here on the cliff. Say, we're talking some very high technology when it comes to architecture, the sort of thing you would expect to see in an elvish city. Sites of interest, the fortress of the Eldar, the overall plan. We got the stats for Gladriel and Selborn, her husband, and Celbrimber. And we got a entire bio of Nydia, the ring that Gladriel wears and reveals to Frodo during the war. Os and Adele during the Third Age. Most of your good NPC characters to deal with Sauron himself. We got his stats as the Lord of Gifts, the Jewel Smith, Celbrimber himself. Here's an image of Celbrimber defending the gates of the halls of the Jewel Smiths against the Orc invasion, and much to his, I'm sure he laid about pretty strong, but eventually, at the end of the day, we also have an entire chapter on the creation of this rings. Not so much the rings themselves, because that's covered in other places, but the process and the elaborate mechanics that in a storyline verbiage that follows the technology of the jewelsmiths, i.e., the smiths themselves, the tools and techniques, forging, smelting, the workshops, the high jewel smithies, favorite gems, silver smithies, the gold smithies, metal smithies, etc. And there's good backstory, background information. If I think I borrowed some of this stuff as how do they make a magic ring? Well, this is before our wonderful Dungeons and Dragons magic or writers and creators started coming up with the rules for crafting magic items and stuff yourself. We didn't always have that, and in the process, I always had players that wanted to know how to do something like that, and I borrowed from this pretty extensively until we actually got rule books established on the subject. So, it has a lot of value from that perspective, at least for me. And the lands, geography, the flora, the fauna, of course. Like I said, there's a whole section on elves, which I did a blog on the subject, so I'm not going to go into depth on it here. I'm not going to repeat myself. Good stuff here. Really are. They even got a few adventures in the back. A lot of NPC charts. Nice color maps that go here. Except this here is actually one of the, I think this is Northern Mirkwood map. Why it's in here, I don't know. But I'll leave it in here so I know I still have it. I just won't know where. Right? Okay. So, Lorien and the halls of the Elven Smiths. It's a good source book. It's a good read. A lot of excellent material here for background and story. Just learning to understand what goes on with the elves in Tolkien's world and how important and how connected they are to a lot of the high magic and magic items as known in the world. So, if you can get it, lay your hands on it. You can borrow it from a friend and read it. You can get a PDF version. It's worth having. Until next time.